All right, we are ready to get going. Just about 30 seconds ahead of schedule here, which is, I think, great because we have a lot to talk about. So I am going to bring our panelists into our room here, and we're going to say hi to them. I will remind everyone at this time to please keep your cameras off and your mics muted. We will have security features on this call for that, but for this brief moment, please do not unmute yourself or start your video unless you are a panelist. And at this point, we are having our panelists join us. We'll welcome them onto the screens. They can all wave as they come in, and we will do introductions once we gather. I know that I am very excited for this panel discussion and very excited to be at the BAC at 6:15 p.m. on a Friday night. Until about 8 p.m., you can see that we have some other students still here. This is the end of Studio Review Week. And that might be why we see some students here very focused on their computers. And that might be why we don't see as many people here or a lot of stuff on the tables. You can see some of the remnants of things around, but a lot of people have wrapped up their reviews. They are ready to get going. And I know I am ready to do some travel soon here. All right. We have everyone here. Welcome to this panel discussion. I'm going to briefly introduce things, but really I want to save time and prioritize talking, right? Talking about this subject matter. I'm actually going to not laboriously go through what we're doing. You guys can read the description, some of the things that is out there. But I do want to mention that this is the third panel discussion of this semester, and this is a part of a new technology techniques series that is run primarily by the Department of Digital Media Education at the Boston Architectural College and in collaboration with AIAS at the BAC as well. Today, Lauda, who you can see is with me in Computer Lab 407. She is our co-moderator at this moment, a non-speaking role, but she is in the chat. So please reach out to the chat. And Lauda, I'm not sure if you waved. I actually looked away, but feel free to wave and say hi. Or thumbs up. That's even better. All right. I do want to again mention a few things. First, we do collaborate with AIAS on this because we are really importantly engaging students, right? This is for students. We are bringing professionals, former students, current students, all different people as panelists. But the point of this is to bring new technology techniques to them as they're working. We can see they're working now, right? And I'm sure they're furiously trying to get through things. Here, as they're working, we want to inspire them to not be maybe so anxious about technology, to start to see what is developing and to describe, don't be afraid to describe technically what's happening. Like, don't keep this at a top level, like that high ivory tower or whatever, right? Feel free to use technical terms. With that said, there's important aspects to this series, which is I encourage everyone to petition for things they find interesting and things they want to see or want to try. These are panel discussions. We fully and very resolutely want to demonstrate things more, and we want to workshop things more. So I have told all my panelists throughout this entire series, and will continue to tell them, that they are not allowed to share things, images. One of us here has found a way slightly around that. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But if you guys hear something that you are interested in, please petition for it. And the BAC will acknowledge that petition. And Peter will make sure the BAC acknowledges that petition. All right. I'm excited. And what we are going to do is we are going to talk about visualization. I have decided that this is going to be about visualization with a very common trend that we're talking about now, which is animation, games, A lot of people are talking about this, but with the help of one of our panelists, we decided to kind of do this along with, let's say, GIS, geography, map making. So there are two seemingly different topics, but as I've had conversations and been thinking about this, there are many overlaps. And I think this is going to be a really, really helpful conversation. I typically go in order of introduction based on who reached out to me first. And actually, many times the people who reach out and respond to my call for interest are people that recently graduated, that are a part of this, and they become, in many ways, the lead for these panelists. So I have known Ian Farley for a while. He's worked with me. I can't remember which was the first course, if it was visual thinking or another one. Ian's shaking his head. And Ian has a really interesting story, which I really want him to describe it because there's a huge and important through line with what he's doing. Go ahead, Ian.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Peter. Like Peter said, my name is Ian Farley. I am currently a senior animator at Counterpunch Studios, which is owned by Virtuous Games. It's a global virtual game studio. I did attend Boston Architectural College a while back, recently graduated with my master's in game design from Full Sail University. Uh, some of the recent projects that we've worked on are things like Marvel's Midnight Suns, and there's a couple unnamed projects that I can't go into. But one of the things that I'm excited about with this, with the new technologies, is the bridging the gap between the architectural and the game world. What we're seeing with Unreal 5's release and the capabilities of bringing Revit, Rhino, AutoCAD directly into the Unreal 5 game engine and do real-time rendering, plus animation, all 3D scanned environments, full 3D scanned characters. You literally can scan your own face, put it on one of the characters, and drop it in now. And this is all free software. This is all that is publicly available to anybody to learn. And seeing how this is developing within the college campuses, especially the BAC, seeing if students were actively using this now. How can we get them to start actively using this and explore a different realm of visualization when they're showing off their projects? VR is another route that also ties into this very heavily, and I'm super excited to see how some of the panelists go into the VR realm. And then there's the elephant in the room of artificial intelligence and how that actually affects this when we go into it. But that's Unreal is definitely where my house has been, that and using the software called Maya. We typically stay away from 3D Studio Max and Blender. Maya is a software that is way more enveloped by Autodesk, way more animation heavy. Tool sets are a lot heavier. So anybody have any questions about that? I am more than willing to have longer conversations about Maya and Unreal and how it's progressing further.
Thank you, Ian, for being here. And Ian and I are talking about, what is the future of animation at the BAC? What are some potential overlaps? And I really value that Ian has continued to engage this community, even though he kind of decided to go and get a degree somewhere else. But this is a great case study of what the opportunities of studying architecture, studying landscape architecture, studying interior architecture design are. Here, let's move on. We're going to go to Jerry next. And Jerry, you and I have worked together for a while, not so much recently, but you have communicated some interesting shifts in your career. And you've been engaged in this career for a while. You've taught animation rendering with me for a while. There's some interesting shifts in that as well. So Jerry, what's your story and what are you interested in talking about?
Yeah, so a quick background about me. I worked at a creative agency here in Boston, but I have been doing, producing visualization for primary architects, builders, and developers for the last 15 years. So animation is a staple in a typical studio collateral. So that alongside with renderings, real-time experiences, we try to use whatever strategies to help our clients visualize their design. And more often than not, we employ a combination of these deliverables to accommodate all marketing applications that our clients would then roll out to the public. So in our line of work, there are a few reasons client would opt for a animation despite their cost and production schedule. One is that they try to encapsulate factual information of the design for internal reviews. So these can be, as informal or informative as you want it to be. So it can be construction or demo time lapses, say 360 aerial turntables, or walkthroughs to evaluate spatial relationships. Second is they will want to build a premise and to illustrate just how the space can or should be used by its occupants and sell it to, to prospective buyers and renters, combined. Lastly, animation is quite effective in conveying, say, a narrative and evoking a particular mood or emotion. So I would say if a picture is worth 1,000 words, you could argue that animation is really a direct extension of that. In fact, an animation is really just a simple series of rendered images, like a flipbook. Even though my experience isn't so much in animation, or as character animations or things like that, but as a visualizer that have dealt with animations before by producing, say, walkthroughs and short architectural films, what are some of the considerations that we have to make? Well, there are some implications and benefits to that. So I plan to touch on these couple points uh, tonight. So that's basically what I'll be focusing on.
Great. Thank you. And we have a pretty heavy kind of animation or game design or whatever presence here. But next, we're going to go to Paul, who I started working with when I first started the directorship here. I was an adjunct overlapping at the same time. I don't think we ever talked to each other before I stepped into the director role, but I'm pretty sure the room you taught in was room 406, right? And
Yes.
yes, and I believe that it might be empty right now because you're not there teaching, and no one's like, but Paul, I would love for you to describe your role, describe like in detail what it is you do. I've kind of associated, you taught a class on GIS. It was mainly an introduction for landscape architecture students, but that it's so much more than that. So Paul, feel free to go ahead.
All right. Am I muted? No, I'm talking. Good. Um, so yeah, I've been working in geography for a while, and in particular trying to bridge the worlds of 3D design and GIS. I worked at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard for about 20 years and worked at the BAC for 5 years. And now I've been doing consulting for the local municipalities, trying to uh, start a culture of collaborative city modeling. Um, I have some first general thoughts about visualization that I would like to put out there. I, that I think as animals that with eyes that evolved in a world full of photons bouncing around, our eyes have developed into a really useful tool for cognition and understanding that is operating kind of in the background and we take it for granted, but it's super powerful for pattern recognition, detections of pattern disruption, uh, pattern extrapolation, um, understanding the familiar and juxtaposing that with what might be novel in a particular scene, interpretation of shadows. It's really amazing. Just like NVIDIA has really taken over in computing, our visual circuits are just natural cognition that goes on without even thinking about it. Um, and so one of the things that kind of multiplies that is anytime you've got coordinates and meaningful coordinates and you have a lot of data that is organized systematically according to coordinates, even charts of temperature fluctuations and things like that, a chart or a graph just exposes the patterns that are meaningful. And so what it makes geography super cool is that for 2,500 years, independent observers have been making their observations available in this geographical coordinate space. And you add the time dimension, and you have really amazing capabilities to organize data visually that corresponds with the real world, maybe, but also corresponds with proposals and ideas and the historical trends that can be kind of laid bare and made available to people through these great visual circuits that we have. I've got a couple of projects going on, and you can see them at pbcgis.com. The one that I'm going to highlight here is called cityschema.org, which I've been working with the cities of Cambridge and Boston to develop a kit of templates and tools for organizing city models that are collaborative efforts between the municipal GIS agencies, but designers who can contribute models. Designers can download chunks of the models, and they're tiled, so they're easily accessible within your normal design tools. And so it's a great environment for visualization where designers can work within a picture of the existing condition. They can do their designs in context of the existing condition, but they can also share their models so that the greater design community can have a common operating picture that includes proposed buildings that are in the review pipeline. And so everybody's designs can be informed by not only what's going on, but what will be going on. And what is really, well, I think it's cool. And I think that probably people at the BAC students, hopefully they're already using the Boston model, which you can go and download, easily discoverable if you search for Boston or Cambridge 3D models. They're very easy to use. And let's just see if I forgot anything. No, that's basically it. I'm really hoping that as the project moves forward, that people start using it to model historical scenarios as well. So give it a try and contact me if have any fun or if you notice any problems.
Thanks, Paul. I really truly believe that you reaching out to me and calling and responding to this call of interest, or me kind of encouraging you to, is going to add a bunch to this discussion. As you just talked, I was reminded too of like all the overlaps that I perceived with this. And that's like, we're talking about time, the introduction of different dimensions into representation. We're talking about world building or world representing. I think those are very related between game design or animation, right? We see the ability to control time. And I also like am going back to a really interesting moment for me, which is when I wanted to world build. A lot of that came from me playing Dungeons and Dragons as a kid, right? And the thing you do in that is draw maps and you build those worlds. And then you start to realize that you can use things like MS Paint to make your characters. And then you get into thinking that you can, 3D model your characters and then animate them and all this cool stuff, right? So thank you, Paul, for being here. I really encourage you to speak up, even though you're a little outnumbered at this time. All right. And with that, we're going to go, speaking of more animators, but I'll let Andrew decide what he is and what he's doing. But me and Andrew have worked together. He has taught spatial thinking with me for a while now. At this point, I've probably forgotten when we started doing that. And that is a class at the BAC which does focus on representing spaces that we design. It's a really key moment. It's a studio supportive class where they are using Rhino and Revit, which are problematic, right, or troublesome things to design. And they're working with representation that typically has been like orthographic, perspectival, single images. But we've started to introduce animation. We started to introduce gaming. We started to introduce introduction. And I'm going to let Andrew also talk about, I'm not sure what inspired you to shift your career, not a full shift, but what is that about, Andrew?
Yeah, full shift would leave me with much too much free time on my hands. Yeah, that's great, Peter. I'm in my 5th year as an adjunct at the BAC. So that's kind of how long we've been working together in digital media. I'm an architect. registered architect, and what it means to be an architect is changing a little bit, and that's one of the things I'm most interested in. But I run a practice, of a moderate sized practice based in Boston. It's called Stack and Co. And I spend a fair amount of my time, really, putting actual buildings together with a somewhat typical architectural process as a principle, a design principle in my practice. My academic work has always been at the total polar opposite of the kind of putting buildings up thing. And so I've going back to my master's thesis, I was working with virtual space, creating a kind of a VR project coded in Unity that was a kind of a future of the vision of the art space, and looking at new media like animation work, tilt brush paintings, and thinking about how the architectural space, bricks and mortar, were no longer the right way to display these kinds of new media artworks, and began to think about, okay, how do we create a space that is the ideal space for displaying new media? And that space, conclusion I came to, was virtual space. So that was kind of kind of early research that I began doing. Currently, in addition to my practice as kind of a straight ahead architect, I also work independently on Hollywood production design, and then also some interactive gaming projects. Most of that work is Unreal Engine, essentially as an Unreal artist. But I'm also involved in some other aspects of production design that touch more the physical world, and things that can be done in what we say in camera versus in a virtual space. I began a kind of semi-pivot, as Peter said, about 2 years ago, and went to LA, to the Southern California Institute of Architecture, SCI-Arc, to do some independent research in their EDGE Institute for Advanced Study in Architecture. And that's where I kind of became hooked into this kind of production design world. I worked for a guy named James Chinland, who is the production designer of the Batman and Avengers and Planet of the Apes. And most of what I did for him was pre-vising, something that Ian and others, Ian particularly, would be familiar with, pre-visualization using Unreal Engine of things that would ultimately be shot in camera in these projects. So Ian was a student of mine, and is a current collaborator of mine on an independent project that we're developing, that is game related. And so, but it's funny because when Ian was my student, he sort of came to me and said, hey, like, like, this is cool, architecture is cool, but I'm thinking about going back into the gaming world, and what do you think about that? And I said, me too. Like, that was like the moment. So anyhow, what I'm mostly focusing on now, is narrative. And in spatial thinking at the BAC, we talk a lot about narrative. I've spent a lot of time as an architect trying to invest my kind of brick and mortar built meat space architecture projects with narrative, and like taking things that are, buildings, and trying to make them creative and narrative driven and poetic and so forth. And more now, I'm just sort of doing the narrative part, and I'm really using my architectural skills for creating almost pure narrative, right? It's a really interesting time for the discipline of architecture. There's very little doubt that we're in crisis as a discipline, in a number of different ways. And out of that crisis comes the potential for architects to use our skill sets in different ways. And in particular, in the kind of pipeline of entertainment is kind of one of the things that I'm interested in. I'm very interested in pipeline. Maybe we'll get into that tonight. What it means to kind of what the architectural pipeline looks like versus what a kind of entertainment type or gaming pipeline looks like. I think it touches visualization very closely because of the place that visualization occupies in an architectural pipeline, which is often sort of like at the end. Anyway, we can get into that. something that that Jerry said about frames and like kind of how an animation is a frame, a series of frames. One of my primary focuses right now with the projects I'm developing is this idea of the difference between sort of what I call dead frames that are kind of the images we see in a movie, in a TV series that are just frames, or even a cinematic that's been rendered out frame by frame in V-Ray, versus what I call live frames, which are frames coming straight out of a game engine. And the big difference between watching something that is sort of happening in engine versus watching a series of frames that have been rendered and are going to be the same every time you watch them. So anyway, these are some of the things that I am focusing on. So it's amazing to see Ian here and be together on this panel, having had a student teacher relationship, and then Ian also worked at my office as an architect as well. So anyway, it's cool.
Good to see you too, Andy.
I agree. There are some really amazing overlap stories here, right? And we're talking about narrative, which I think is really important. In terms of visualization, which is essentially what we're talking about. And Andrew, you've really taught a lot of that and really seen a lot of changes back to that spatial thinking class. I'm going to go next to our last panelist, Michael, who is the through line for this one, as Michael participated on the computation panel previous to this. And me and Michael have worked together for a while. We can see what I said last time I introduced you. But one of the major things that we've worked on is the Boston Society of Architects Knowledge Community Design Viz, Design Visualization. I can't remember if we decided to do VIZ or VIS or whatever, Michael. That was a long time ago. But please, Mike, you, I know, don't necessarily have like specialization in some of these topics. However, you do see a lot of this playing out in firms, and also with that connection to the BSA, which I think is really important. What about visualization is intriguing you?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up the BSA, and as a future follow-up to this discussion, if anyone is interested in this, we do have this knowledge community. We do focus on design viz, design visualization. It's actually, when we started this group, we wanted to call it visualizing design, because we thought that was actually closely more connected to what the mission was of this group. It was, how do we visualize design better and new ways and more clear ways so we can do better design. It wasn't just to do some cool viz for the sake of doing cool viz. So hopefully that distinction excites you. And if you want to be part of this in the future, then let's keep this conversation going. Let's be more interactive and let's be more visual. I mean, it's kind of funny now that we're doing this, we're talking about visualization, but we're not allowed to share anything visual. This is essentially a podcast talking about visualization. So meeting after and having something to react to respond to visually. To Paul's point, visualizing things makes us think differently and makes us interact. So I love all the what's been shared so far. I mean, I'm willing to talk about anything, including MS Paint, if that's what you want to talk about, Peter. But to kind of recap what I'm hearing, and hopefully we can get more into it, is that animations, games, these are about interaction. These are about, like Jerry, what you mentioned, evoking a narrative. Like there's an emotional response from what we do to visualize. And we analyze the past with our visualizations and the present, looking at mapping. And we, more importantly, maybe that's not the way to say it, but another way to do it is that we imagine the future. A lot of what architects do is living in a future world that doesn't exist. And we want to bring others into that same vision that have money to make that a reality in the future, right? That's our goal. So we try to use tricks. We try to use ways of fooling our imaginations, giving us the confidence that the future can be achieved, reducing risk. One way I'm fooling you all is pretending I'm in your space in the BAC. Not a hard piece of technology to press a few buttons. Better than being in my kitchen and having my dog eating behind me. But you'll never know that because it looks like I'm right there with you. And in some ways, aren't I closer to you, thinking that you're in the same space? I'm tricking you. You know the trick, but This is just one way of many that I think we all could use a lot of really technical things that hopefully we can get into. But I think that's the goal. All in all, is to build confidence for changing the world in a better way.
Right. And in what we're discussing, I think there's a question of what is the world, right? Is the world this like IRL in real life space? Is the world a game? Is the world a map? All that kind of stuff. And what I want to do now is we're going to move on to like a 15, 20-minute segment where we talk amongst ourselves. So I'm going to call to 2 panelists at a time. One of them is the lead, and the other will have a conversation. This recommendation actually came from Mike. We were talking earlier about that 5 is a little bit much, but we're going to spread out this. And then we are going to go into a piece where we ask if there's any questions. So if anyone who is watching, please, Laura is there in the chat. You can ask your questions there. We also will have the opportunity, if people feel comfortable, and we feel comfortable, you can join us on screen, is also an opportunity. Now, we're going to go to Ian primarily, and Andy, I want you to be listening along here as you guys, have a repertoire between the two of you. Ian, I'm going to pose this really quickly. What are blueprints?
Thank you, Peter, for asking that question immediately. So for the architecture perspective, what we think of blueprints is different than what I envision blueprints. Working in the game design space within Unreal, the way that you develop through visual scripting is called a blueprint. It's a node-based system that allows an artist to go in and literally connect nodes inside of a visual space that call actions to happen. So when we think of animation and Jerry talking about flipbooks, for a game trigger, when a player plays, for it to trigger a cinematic to immediately play, that's built in the back end using a blueprint, not a two-dimensional, even though when you're visually looking at it, it is two-dimensional on the screen, but it is a three-dimensional coded representation of a connection that causes an action or an animation to play through. And that covers every aspect of a game development. In the Unity timeframe, that's all physically done, again with the physical, through C++ understanding of an actual coding language. Unreal has been really, really great about making that more capable for artists to jump in that don't necessarily have that technical understanding and background. It makes it really great as an opportunity for architects and new designers to jump in and grasp the knowledge base and start applying that and seeing how far that can push their designs and their visualization of whatever imagination that they've got actually on screen. That's my blueprint.
And I think I want Andrew to talk through into this as well, but I really want to key in on that, right? The overlapping of these terms. And yeah. I'm curious to go back and look at when that happened, right? If it did come from the original use, like not the original, but if the original use of blueprints was from the world of architecture or spatial design, or if it was from before that, right? I actually don't know. I've never done research into that. Yeah. Andrew, please speak to this. And also, I wanted to bring up something I've seen you do, which I believe you refer to as overdrawing in your visuals. So go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool, Ian. I work a lot with both kinds of blueprints, and so as Ian said, Unreal Engine used to have this thing called Unreal Script, which was a kind of visual coding interface. It's been replaced by this thing called Blueprints. And it's a lot for architects and architecture students. It's a lot like Grasshopper, right? There's definitely and it's a lot like a bunch of other visual coding things, like the way we build up shaders. There's also a bunch of music and audio effects chaining that is kind of similar in programs like Logic and so forth. But just on the other end of the architecture blueprint thing, it's funny. That term is really funny because obviously we don't use blueprints anymore in architecture. The archaic process of literally rolling out blueprints with those specific chemicals that make them blue. But we use a lot of other weird architecture terms that clients don't understand to mean the same thing, like CDs and working drawings. And so I think as architects, we often might find ourselves saying to our clients, the blueprints. And so the blueprint has become this term that means the documents that we're going to build off of in the field. So yeah, the connection between the two, there's a whole logic that the visual coding exposes, that if you're just coding in scripting, you don't see any of the logic, so it's spatial, right? In a way, there's a spatialization of seeing the flow of information through a blueprint. And then overdrawing is a technique of taking a photograph of in real life, or particularly building a quick scratch 3D model and then drawing over that. It's almost a way of constructing a perspective drawing with a little bit of quick modeling in Rhino or similar, instead of the normal ways we construct a perspective drawing on the page. It's also really useful tool from drawing from a photograph. With all this technical stuff, I weirdly come from a background of doing a lot of drawing by hand and drawing on my tablet based on some of the architects who are my mentors. And this process of taking a photograph and drawing over it is wildly powerful when you use it to develop. And also, as I say with my students, like, what's our most flexible design tool? It's this. And if you leap or into Rhino or Revit or anything too soon, you lose some of that flexibility. So it's about using the pen, which isn't going to tie you to any particular expression. So yeah.
Yeah, there's so many new methods of representation. And I know someone else here is very good at using a tablet to draw on, and looks very professional when she holds her tablet and she's smiling. It's Lauda. But we're seeing these develop, right? And what I want to do is I want to go to Paul next. And Jerry, I want you to listen in. So Paul, you work in these maps, right? And you've talked with me about a very similar, to me at least, topic, which is accessibility of these things, of these representations. And I think that comes through two different ways. One, making maps and building maps, and two, viewing maps and understanding those. And passionately, you've said that maps should be more accessible to populations to see what's going on, right? And so I'll leave it up to you which side of those two you want to talk a little bit about, and maybe make some comparisons to the terms, the tools that you've heard Ian and Andrew talk about, what tools in mapping do you feel that new designers should learn? Or what tools, representation methods do you feel that the public, the general population, by viewing maps? And Jerry, as you listen, think about what might be overlap there that changes the way you think about the tools you use. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, okay, that's a great topic, and I'd say that one of the most important things that's happened with accessibility of maps in the last 20 years has been the advent of map services and the instant availability of, ortho photographs, to anyone, which are, hugely advantageous when you want an up-to-date view of, what are the street alignments, in my design area, and things like that. Where are the trees and the plants, and how's the tree canopy doing, and all of those kinds of things are exposed in these ortho photos that you can get for free off of Google Earth, Google Maps. And so that is sort of a ground floor answer to your question. But I think that another interesting kind of dimension of accessibility, and one that's kind of in contention now, is interoperability. And so maps are a thing that we get through our eyes and stuff, but data is really key when it comes to doing design, and you want to use geographic information in your designs. And this accounts for 2D information and also 3D information that I'm working on now. And the big issue in that now is proprietary data formats, and these companies like Autodesk and Esri that try to keep everybody locked in to their universes. And it's for a person like me who's willing to sort of like work for very cheap and to expose data in open formats, I get a lot of satisfaction from that. But um, and I hope other people in Boston take advantage of this because it's a thing that it requires effort. If we leave all of this stuff to Autodesk and Esri, uh, these data won't be accessible for us to do designs with unless you're working for some humongous, government agency or design firm. So I don't know whether that you were expecting me to go in that direction, but that's my pet peeve nowadays.
I share the sentiment very much so. And I am vocally very critical of large corporations and their monopolies on design software, design data. I was having a conversation. I'm also helping the Boston Society of Architects plan some programming on AI. We're going to kind of stay away from AI in this conversation. We can mention it, but everyone hears a lot about it nowadays. But yeah, this is important, and accessibility of data. Jerry, what were you thinking about?
Well, I was listening in and started to think about one of my recent projects that I worked on, which is called Project Hillside. So this is a project that was done in Unreal 5. And it was a collaboration between the studio that I used to work at, Epic Games, and Safdie Architects. Essentially, this is a vision that Moshe Safdie had when he was putting together his thesis. And one of our tasks was to visualize his grand vision. This is basically it evolves into all the design principles that he is utilizing in his projects now. But this is Habitat 67. What we see in Montreal, that little boxy building that are just all staggered, that's essentially part of his design. But then he actually put together a proposal as his graduating thesis that encompasses more than that. And our task on the project was to envision that, but in Unreal 5 and utilizing all the technologies and techniques that was used in game development, and just try to see how it would be like if it were built today. So we actually went through a whole bunch of different phases of the project, and Andy talked about pre-visualization. This is something that we often have to do as well, and we try to grab like open source data, like I think CatMapper is one, which you can just draw a region and be like, hey, I want to grab the massing of the city, because as you know, this Habitat 67, it was built in Montreal on a really thin peninsula that is right outside of the city. And the premise of Habitat 67 is to use it as one of the exhibits for the World Expo 67. And so across the water, there's a bunch of islands, man-made islands, but also the downtown Montreal. And we were just trying to figure out how we can piece all that information together. So we went through ArcGIS data for height maps and utilizing, the massing that came out of CatMapper, which you can, if the region is within the boundary, you can get and download those information for free. But then there was also, vehicular traffic data of paths, for example, that we were trying to pull from, say, OpenStreetView. And so there's all these open source information that, would be made it so much easier for us to string together all these data points and data sets all together in order to finish this project that was Project Hillside. So Project Hillside is one of the biggest projects that I've worked on, not because of the project scale, but just the fact that this is going to be done on a different platform, a real-time platform that is fairly new in the world of architectural visualization. So being able to have access to these is fantastic.
I agree. And now I'm not sure if you gave me kind of a private showing of this thing you had built and what the status of that is, but it sounds like something we would love to see.
Yeah.
I was impressed.
It's actually on one of the websites that Epic have released. Basically, the project took about more than a year. We had to go through a pretty robust review process with Epic Games. As you can imagine, they want top of the line quality, and so the expectation was really high for architectural visualization up to this point, because mostly, unless you're pushing the limits of your hardware or your GPU, you're really limited to, well, I wouldn't say limited to, it's that what you usually see online, like on YouTube or on TikTok or whatever, people usually just put together like a simple interior, right? Even though it can be as realistic as it can be in engine, but it never really pushes the envelope. How can we visualize not only interior space, but I just envision the whole master plan? And, like Ian was saying, Unreal 5 has developed these new tools that allow us, throw as much into the pot. And with the technology that is like, Neonite, Lumen, you can really do a lot with that. But yeah, the project is actually released earlier this year, like around May, and Epic had done several write-ups about how the process went into the material, into the scene assembly, and the animation of like people and traffic and things like that. So you can actually look online and find Project Hillside.
That's great. And we're going to go to Michael next, and another just 5 minutes before we entertain questions from our audience here. I did want to say and mention that, like I said, that is something I think we would all love to see a demonstration of. And I would like people to use the petition, which Laura is going to put in the chat, to say, I am interested in seeing that, right? I would like to engage with this. Mike, what?
I was just looking online for that project.
And you're gonna like turn your screen around and show it like you breaking the rules.
Right. And Jerry, is that an interactive, I'll call it game, or is it more of an animation that's formed from all that?
Well, the original scope is that we were tasked to do two cinematics. One is going to be the teaser, and the other one is just going to be a full-blown architectural visualization, the traditional type of visualization that you would see. And it sort of evolves over time, because when the benefit of having a project in Unreal is that once you have the data set in it, you can do whatever you want with it, right? Yeah. And so that sort of blew away like all the expectation that you would usually normally get from, oh, I need a 2-minute short film, or I need 10 images to be rendered out. Right. You can create as many images as you want, but for the contract that we have with Epic, it's to produce cinematics. The tack on was, okay, now that we have this data that we are using to create all these animation, let's just put together, how easily can it be done to have like a pixel streaming version of it. So when you go online, the website that you can look at Project Hillside on through Epic, they actually have a pixel streaming button that allows you to go in and navigate through a couple of the the points, across the project. So to answer your question, it's not so much just a cinematic, but it's a interactive experience as well.
Mm-hmm. So good. Sorry to digress, Peter. Do you have a question for me?
I do. So you oversee architecture, right? The group. And I have a question. What scares you about this?
About what exactly?
Animation, mapping, right? Like, I mean, I'm just like, what are you kind of like maybe potentially critical of? I know you're excited about these things. I know that, but I want to hear that other viewpoint, right? Like, what should we be maybe concerned about?
I guess I'm much too enthused to be scared. So I'd have to dig deep to see where the challenges might be, or yeah, where the deep fear might be.
And maybe that's the danger with it itself.
But yeah, and I get to give others the context that you know about too. So I run the architecture department within SMMA. We're an integrated practice. So we're about 220 people overall, and about 65 or so are architects. So you can kind of do the math and see that with all the work that we're doing, I get excited to see the opportunities that we have with our clients and with our talent to find interesting ways to not just do things from a design technology point of view, because we have a great design technology group within the office, or also our sustainability group can connect to projects. But my role is to kind of see how all these things connect and interact, and finding opportunities in the moment in projects, and then connect the dots in some way. I love the internal research we do, and finding people that have ideas. Like, I'd like to visualize something, I'd like to do this, and I get excited quickly, but I try to act responsibly and talk to folks and say, should we do this? Should we do that? So I think part of my job is kind of risk management in a sense. We can't just jump to every shiny new thing and decide to roll it out. So we do these smaller things that we can fail at, and we can fail quickly. We can fail in a way that's not going to hurt clients, et cetera. So we do a lot of this testing. And so when I look at visualization, I don't know. I mean, we maybe the biggest fear is that we can get sucked into a world that can suck a lot of time out of us, so that we get too excited about, say, over modeling, in a sense, if we're looking at our Revit models or something like that, or spend too much time putting a grasshopper jig together when we can just do something faster in Rhino, and knowing, what we want to do in our minds. So it might come down to speed. That could be one thing that I fear, and one thing that I see as a potential, a rabbit hole that you could just follow so long. And, at the end of the day, we're getting paid for our time. So we have to be careful with that resource. But yeah, again, I'm much too excited about where we're going with all this, and how we use these media to help design. One thing I'll share that's kind of unique and connected to some of the conversations we had already about animation and even filmmaking. I think Andrew kind of brought that up, or maybe jazzing on what Jerry was saying, is that we have at SMMA something new called SMMA Productions. We have filmmaking in our company as a design study. And two quick things. One is an example where we were designing a boathouse for Gentle Giant, and our cameraman went down one morning. You can imagine on the Charles River, it's a nice cool day, the fog coming off the river, and just spent time taking really great videos of the rowers, and the geometry of the oars hitting the water, and all the beauty that you can probably imagine as I'm saying this. Taking the boats into the water, all 8 people simultaneously moving the boat over into and then presented that to the design team. We actually had a larger in-house competition to everybody, and so he presented this short documentary, this short movie with a nice background music, a score. He's so talented. His name is Lucas, and was able to. We as designers were able to see something beyond just our own imagination. So here's data, essentially, visual data of recording his own kind of feelings about things, but it was in a perspective we got to see, so that we can respond to design. And so, is filmmaking the only way to do design? No, but is it something that can really help us? We believe so. Can we spend too much time on it? Perhaps. So let's be careful. Another thing is, in post-occupancy, instead of just doing a survey, we're now able to interview the users of our buildings, like students and teachers in our schoolwork, being able to just quickly prompt them. So it's not meant to be really overly scripted. And then to see people, like students, interacting with the spaces, and provide us the feedback as designers of how we see the space being used. and to put it in like a 7-minute video. It's so super inspiring. So I think this, Neoscape has done things like this in the past for the sake of marketing, and part of it is marketing for us as well. But I think a bigger part of it is for us to see what we're designing and what we're about to design. In the case of the boathouse, that feedback of visualization is just really cool, and it's kind of a unique thing, combining animations that we're doing with actual model virtual things, and drone work, so we can see what's happening, reality capture, all these things, bringing them into a movie making platform for us has been really, really helpful. In the last two years, we've been doing this, and now we're releasing more of these videos. You'll see more in the coming year. Exciting, isn't it?
It is very exciting. And I really am intrigued with that concept of documentation. I said documentation, which we use in the field a lot, but it's a documentary, right? We talk about post-documency, and we're using this format, whether it came before we saw that animation became a part of spatial design or after, I'm not sure. It is really intriguing. We're going to jump to some audience stuff. And so this is the time we're going to entertain questions from the audience. Please put them in the chat. Please indicate if you would like to kind of lend your voice to this, right? One comment I'm going to paraphrase here, which is discussing graphics without visual representation seems interesting, but now I'm eager to see it in action. I need visuals. It's clever because it prompts me to search and learn, but there's one issue: I can't recall the name. And this is more common. I'm going to phrase a question and then ask another thing. I want you guys to think about that. And what does that mean? This is probably coming from a student, right? Like, I need visuals. Like, I'm used to this, right? And then this concept, this idea of I can't remember the name. I think they might be referring to maybe what Jerry was talking about or something like that. But what is that? We have this conception that everything we do digitally is remembered forever. This is not true. And there's something there. Now, to a more specific question, which I'm going to put to Ian and encourage other people to talk to this, but I also want Paul to be thinking about like the other side of this. This is related to speed. So Paul, think about this. This is going to be a little tricky. Ian, in terms of speed, would you consider that in the long-term period, you would save more time creating something you have in mind once you have passed the slow tryout? And I'll let you interpret that. And Paul, while Ian kind of thinks, I saw him go, oh gosh. Well, Paul, while Ian, you get ready, Paul, think about this idea of time, right? It takes a long time to create a map and that stuff. So after Ian's done, please respond to that.
So repeat the question or the statement one more time, because the way that I'm interpreting this is a lot about time management and really using your resources, understanding the tools in a way to alleviate that slow portion that you're talking about, because it's all beneficial. So please read that again for me so I can make sure that I'm getting this correct.
Yeah, so the question says, in terms of speed, would you consider that in the long-term period, you would save more time creating something you have in mind once you have passed the slow tryout? And we're also going to let some comments come in. Ian, respond how you want, and I'll give some clarifying statements as well.
Okay. So when in the game world, specifically, when we talk about what I'm conceptualizing you as saying slow tryout and long term, we refer to slow tryout as more rapid prototyping, which is something that I encourage you to research. There's a guy that does this, and he does extremely fast game developed prototypes, and he does like 10 a day. So it is not something that is slow. It's the iterative process that you currently go through when you think about your architectural perspective in games. It's prototype. So I don't consider that slow. I consider it it may be slow to start, but with practice and patience, it'll become a lot faster, just like your normal iterative process will. And in the long term, your efficiency will definitely increase. Overall, it's something that you have to do. It may seem monotonous and it may seem really trials and tribulations, but end all, you can come back to these projects and these concepts that you're going through, and you can really look back at what it took you to get from point A to point B You learn the mistakes, what to do, what not to do. The next time you do something like this, that slow process has now been cut in half because you realize you don't have to do those mistakes again. Now you figured out an efficient way to produce this in a more effective way to then develop time in the longer. How far can I push this? How really intricate can I get with this? And from a game design perspective, that's super, super important. And for architecture as well, but for specifically for animation, what I do, Andy referred to previs. It's something that I'm currently doing right now internally for an internal demo. And one of the things we try to do is be as fast as possible. And a lot of that is the faster we can get it on screen, the faster we can look at it and see what's working, what's not, change cameras, which is a huge portion of our storytelling. With the animation specifics, so we talk about body animation, describing physical action that are actually happening. We tend not to go into the details. We try to get something blocked in very, very quickly. You do this with design all the time. Once we get that mapped out, we've figured out a pipeline on how this process works. So you develop a pipeline that makes logical sense and increases efficiency so you don't run into those slow times. Everything is part of the production and everything has a key moment that is important for the production. I hope that answers your question and makes sense and opens up a lot more other questions to go along with it.
It does. And I want to go to Paul to respond to this idea of like how much time it takes to make a map and why they're relevant, right? In the meantime, all three of the other panelists, please think about how you might also respond to this question. Paul, go ahead.
Well, I like the question. I think that mapping is a great example of something. It does take a lot of time. I'm going to extend this to 3D modeling as well. But the idea of understanding context is very time consuming if you start from scratch. And the cartographers have an age-old tradition of copying each other, and that's recognized. And as long as you cite your sources, I think that's fine. But it's a great time saver to copy somebody else's map rather than going down on the street and starting from scratch. And it's the same with 3D modeling and city modeling. I think one of the things that there's a great room for improvement and a huge amount of potential if we learn from our bee friends and insects in general to share resources, to remember things that we did. And I think that what I'd like to highlight is this notion of social asset management, where if, for example, making a 3D context model can be very costly. A lot of firms have their 3D models of Boston that they've invested huge amounts of work in, and they're not sharing them, and that's fine. But to have a shared model resource that people can use as a sort of bootstrap, as a boost to sort of start their contextual studies is a humongous time saver. And it just boils down basically to remembering things that you've learned, being able to recall those things systematically, and also a form of public generosity. You know, you see these firms, I'm not going to mention any names, but they have their 3D models and they're very nice. But it's really cool to have an agency like the BPDA that's putting a lot of very cool stuff up on the web for free. It's a giant time saver, and hopefully will amount to the sort of a better design in Boston as a result.
I think, and to give a context, and any of Michael, Andrew, Jerry, you guys are welcome to jump in on this question. Some of the context there, right? Like, how do you orientate yourself, right? What do you spend your time doing? I think those questions are really important for students, right? I started with Ian for a reason, because he was most recently, well, Andy, you also were a student again, but that question, right? Like, what is the advice there? How do we manage time? And through many of our other panel discussions, we've introduced this topic of if we can do things faster, right? Does that mean we should like bill our clients less, or what do we do with that time saved? This is a really controversial topic, and I'm looking at your guys' faces and your reaction. So go ahead, three of you, anyone jump in.
All right, I'll jump in. So what Ian so quickly took this concept of slow tryout and said, you must mean fast tryout. Maybe it's just a communication thing. Is because it seems so obvious that we need to work quickly to try things out, right? And the rapid prototyping is a great term. I use another term all the time in the office where I say it's the 80-20 rule. And it means that you'll get 80% of the output in 20% of the time. And, this goes for so many different things. And it's not an exact science, so try not to datafy it. But this concept that work really fast, or as they say in hospitals, they're going to triage. They're going to understand we have an emergency going on here. How do we quickly assess, and then how do we create a path forward? That's what design is. We're finding just really fast ways to test things really loosely, and then we say these are the things worth pursuing. So to put it a different way, it's important to understand. It's probably more important to understand which things do you need to solve rather than solving the things. Yeah, I'm at the end of my idioms, but I think we get the point that the faster you can do things, the more time you can spend making sure that you're iterating and massaging and polishing, etc. But if you're spending all that time iterating, massaging, polishing the wrong thing, that's a huge time waste.
Yeah, I can jump in here because, through, making and producing architectural films, it's often that we don't just jump in. Like when a client comes to us, we don't just say, okay, let's just start doing things. Because you don't know, there's no direction. Sure, you're going to have, art directors and creative directors that kind of lead you down the right path. But even the first thing that we have to engage with the client is a creative, right? And the creative generally says, oh, what is the goal of this film or this short? And from there, we build a storyboard given that context, because without any context, you're gonna really know or understand what is important and what is not. Often the directors, they will tell you, okay, this is what the client wants to see and so on and so forth. But the storyboard is kind of like the underlying guidelines for everybody in the production. Like, okay, this is what we're trying to accomplish. Basically, it's a shot by shot and frame by frame. Sometimes, you draw out, okay, this is the key moment that you want to capture. And from there, you have the holistic picture. Then you start to think, oh, this is all the things that we want to accomplish. And we start to tackle them one by one. And the planning and execution of the whole film, I think, is the important part. And it does take time because you're iterating and the client have to see it. They will need to comment on it. And sometimes, they don't like it. They want to throw things out, basically force us to go back to the drawing board, be like, okay, what exactly is this redundant? Or, hey, the client wants something to focus on that wasn't previously thought of. So we spend more time doing pre-visualization, trying to make sure that, oh, okay, everybody's on board. From that point on, you really, the race is on. You're basically, okay, we know, I've categorized all the things that needs to be done, so let's just get to it. And when it comes to real-time development in Unreal, or presumably any like Unity, for example, right? You're spending time polishing an asset, making sure all assets looks good from all angles. Comparing to like a static image, right? When you just work on an image, you can, Photoshop things the way that you want to, certainly to some extent. But when your camera is moving, you kind of have to accommodate for all the things that you don't see from that one particular angle. Like maybe there's like a bullet time camera, kind of like the Michael Bay 360, where you have the central focus and the camera just goes around the subject. That you're gonna see a lot more things than you typically have to. So our time usually is spent on working with the asset, making sure everything is looking good. Because once you have the asset, like I just mentioned earlier with Project Hillside, is that you can just do a lot more with it. So you truncate the amount of time at the end, more so than trying to truncate things earlier on, because the shorter time you give yourself early on, that means you're producing not you're limiting yourself from really seeing all the possibilities. And with that being said, that's kind of my 2 cents here. Is like it's more about asset driven. You polishing an asset, but then once you have the asset, you can do a lot more with that. So it's not a time loss per se. It's like you're dedicating or allocating your time to different aspects of the process. So that's what I have to add.
I think that's great. I'm going to interrupt. Andy, you are going to speak next. I know you have some very important things to say, but I really want to key in on this. You can respond with whatever, but I want to give you some prompts on this, which is, as a result of spatial thinking, I've used a lot of things I actually learned from watching the behind the scenes making of The Lord of the Rings, where they were doing previs in that. I'm not sure if it's the first time, but it is a robust time when they were using different methods of videography and production. And I love Lord of the Rings. I've watched that documentary. I actually have a ring that is themed that way. Andy, respond with what you want, but what did you see in teaching that's related to this is what I'm interested in.
Okay. I'm going to start with just picking up on where Jerry was, and I'll tie it into teaching for sure. The I just want to key in on this discussion of kind of real time that rendering that Jerry's talking about. And so, I'll tie it to teaching in this way. So there's an economics of drawing production or graphic production that I talk to my students about a lot, which is kind of, what are the economics of effort you put in relation to the results? It's a lot like the 80-20 rule that Mike's talking about. And so it's things like, for example, that are closely related to storyboarding, for example, but like if you're producing renderings of an architectural project, you're going to build out and refine only things that are within the frame, right? Like we choose our views first, and then if it's behind you, you're definitely not going to put time into refining it visually. And that's kind of basic economics of graphic production. Real-time rendering, but particularly real-time in which we give the audience the ability to navigate the environment, destroys those economics or turns them on their ear. Because there is no frame, like there is no, even it becomes, the user is the director. The user is investigating the environment, and every nook and cranny needs to have kind of the lowest common denominator of fidelity. And so it just keying into what Jerry's saying about, in that real-time environment, those economics are totally changed. You can't rely on just like grabbing your frames and only working on those views. Yeah, it's something that I talk to my students a lot. And also, as we reduce 3D to the 2D, because like it is all going to 2D eventually. So as architects, obviously we take our 3D creations and we create typically these orthographic views, right? And so there's also, even if it's like if you start out on set, in camera, filming actors, filming environments, that is all getting reduced down eventually to a 2D frame that's just pixels. And so there's a lot of the economics of kind of editing the 2D rather than the 3D. If I'm working with my students on a drawing that is derived from a model and they want to go back to the model and remodel something, they often should just edit the pixels of the deliverable that's happening. But that doesn't really work in real time to the degree that that you are not constraining the user. So yeah, I'll just say something about assets too, because I think this is cool. You want to get technical, and I want to pick up with Jerry on assets. Like one of the things that I'm interested in and working on is kind of like basically what I've seen, like over the last few years, I've been exposed to kind of people at all phases of the pipeline of kind of entertainment production, beginning really with concept artists, obviously writers, but concept artists who create essentially, concept art that is used to inform kind of final aesthetic output and final directorial choices in anything, whether it's a video game, a movie, whatever. And the Lord of the Rings example with that, right, is like Alan Rickman and those guys who basically, if you watch the Lord of the Rings, you're like, oh wow, like a guy sat down and drew the caves of Barad-dûr, and they looked when he drew them exactly the way they finally looked on screen. It's this crazy thing about one person synthesizing this whole thing that becomes the final product. But what's happening in the kind of entertainment industry and is that like real-time processes are starting to pervade all stages of the pipeline. So we used to have a concept artist who was just doing digital paintings or physical paintings. That guy is now probably building a Maya model or an Unreal model and painting over it. And you have then in previs, we're prevising with sometimes the art department I worked with, I didn't work on the Batman, but using the Batman for an example, like the whole Batcave was prevised in Unreal and made high fidelity, and all the lighting was looked at, and the director of photography got in there and figured out the shots, and then that was thrown away, and they built the whole thing physically and did it in camera. And so there's this kind of like these forgotten assets that exist along the pipeline that have a lot of potential. And so when Jerry's talking about investing time into the assets, that's something I'm super interested in, is that basically everything I see, I want to play. Like it's like if I watch a movie, I'm like, can I play that? Like I want to play that movie. I want to do interactive is kind of what I'm interested in. So the more we see people building assets at all stages of the pipeline, from that concept artist who built a model and then painted over it, the more our non-interactive products are more ready to become interactive, because all these assets exist and you could suddenly run around that Batcave that was used for previs rather than just never looking at it again and doing it on camera. So this asset thing is absolutely fascinating.
It
Yeah.
is. And there's a ton here, right? I want to go to Paul, and I want to ask Paul something about, you had mentioned to me that designers and reviewers and the public, this is me taking notes as you and I talked recently, right? And also I very much appreciate that I just take all my notes and throw them into ChatGPT, which then results in the descriptions of this. Now, Paul, you mentioned, right, designers and viewers and the public who are all interested in seeing alternative futures. Now, when I think about maps, right, I think about the documentation of the world as we discover it, right? In cartography, actually, my uncle studied cartography for some reason in school. But like, what is up with these alternate futures? And also a really interesting question, which I want to bring also back to this idea of game design, is like, are we lying about things? Like, what is the implications of showing a map with alternate futures, showing data on a map that might misrepresent communities? Actually, we're seeing a lot of these maps being used to misrepresent communities. And then, as I was talking with like Ian and Andy and Jerry, you guys are talking about these games and like you use this physical, like you can physically do it. Ian said this a lot. And I was like, but it's not physical. And how do we deal with this concept of having NPCs, non-playable characters, right, walking around our game models? Paul, go ahead. You guys come in at the end, and then I also, in a little bit here, we're going to entertain some questions potentially from the room. So go ahead, Paul.
Well, there's nothing sinister about asking people to imagine alternative futures, and that's what design is, after all, right? And design is also sales and trying to promote your alternative future and get people to buy into it, literally, or at least with their consent. And so that's been the game. And people think of maps as being a tool for the power elite to sort of like, promote their hegemony and whatever. But it's the same with paragraphs. Paragraphs have the same problem, and people are always trying to promote their point of view. And you got to let the audience be critical, and we need to train people to be critical of paragraphs and maps and 3D models and any kind of time that you've got an interested party giving you an image of something. And so I know that's what you're doing at the BAC, and it's only going to get with AI. It's just going to get even more interesting, and it is something to fear, I think. But the answer is to teach people to question and to be critical. And I love this new trend I've seen a few videos about called data dignity, where as long as we expect AI to cite its sources, and we treat AI the same way we've treated Wikipedia as a way to understand where this knowledge has come from, we'll learn a lot from it. There is something to be feared from ignorant people who believe everything that they see. I fear that. We see it all the time, all over the place. And so in the education business, I think we're all in the right place to sort of like combat that. But in the meantime, I'm going to be promoting my alternative futures. And what I think is really interesting also on the subject of alternative futures is alternative histories.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you there's some really cool data sets out there that are allow you to see, for example, the inner belt, and to overlay the plans for the inner belt inner highway system that would have wiped out Central Square in Cambridge, and to examine that in context is something that is super powerful, I think, to see. And so I hope that when we build these assets and we polish them the way Andrew and Yao were talking about, that we also preserve them and it organize them in a way that allows us to dial back through not just what happened, but the ideas that people had in the past that that never went anywhere, you know, maybe for better or worse. Um, it's so cool, and I hope that answers your question. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely a response. And this is, a topic I don't think there is an answer to, right? As it develops, I'm going to let the all you guys respond and talk a little bit more about this. I am very curious about like non-playable characters or just like these virtualized sims. This is related to me as a digital twin. In the meantime, our co-moderator Lara is going to walk through the other rooms and see if there's any questions there. So just be prepared for you to be interrupted if we find a question, but please go ahead and talk about simulation. Ian, go for it.
So there's a couple things that I wanted to hit on. Michael, you had brought up occupancy and how seeing that physically in the environment makes a huge impact. Peter, with your NPC question. So there's a way to tie both of these in. There's current development using generated NPC characters that are focus driven. So you literally can create the population inside of the architectural environment and give it key triggers, whether it be hunger for a specific type of food, whether it be a path, whether it be if it starts to get too hot outside or a certain time of day, I need to go inside. You can load those into the occupants in this environment, and they will navigate the environment as if they were driven by normal human interaction. These are current developments that are coming out from game studios, diving farther into the AI development side of things. The asset side, when Andy was talking about the Batman cave, it immediately made me start thinking about Mandalorian. The reason is, so the Batman cave, yes, they did previs for it. Yes, they modeled it in 3D. Then they physically built it and threw the model away. The Mandalorian is a different perspective, where the entire room is a live capture stage. The entire room is LED screens. They built the environment in the game engine, used it for the set. So the actors interacted in a room full of LEDs. So they didn't have to time when they needed to schedule a shoot. They needed to capture a sunrise in a desert. They had the desert, they control the sun. They can shoot it at any point in time of day. When are the actors available? 2 o'clock in the afternoon? All right, we're going to shoot a 5 o'clock in the morning sunrise shot. They physically can dial the time back inside of this. And this is something that we're starting to see in education. Full Sail University has recently built a live capture set on campus for the students in the film department and the game design department to use. So these are things to think about when we're talking about the evolution of how these things are looking, without even touching on the real AI-driven aspects. That has been a scary conversation, how that's going to implement things. ChatGPT, I'm glad, Peter, I'm so glad that you're actually finding a use for it other than like writing people's papers for them. But there's an aspect of this that, for what I personally do, so I deal primarily with high fidelity facial animation for cinematics. So that's fax-based information. The fax manual is the facial action coding system, which is a long, medically drawn out process about how your face is actually built, the muscles that control things, push and pull things around. Motion capture data has grown. So you had traditional keyframe animation where you would move the character like a puppet, into motion capture, which is the black suit, infrared dots that were tracked by a series of Vicon cameras, which is a super expensive process, by the way. Now those suits, you can buy one for about $4,000 and they don't have markers. You can shoot it outside in your backyard. It will track whatever data you do. That data comes through and gets applied to a bone structure underneath the 3D model and a character. That is just the body. The face is way more structure moving. There's so much more nuance in what's happening in a face that it's very difficult to capture all that information. And the way that the technology has grown, we went from the same marker data set recording. We were doing that with face, where it was 70 tiny little markers on the face that had to be tracked by camera. And that had to be applied by a makeup artist every single morning to every actor and actress that was coming on set in the exact same position. So it was this 4-hour process to get all this stuff for them to go shoot. And if they started sweating, they'd fall off. It was an issue. You can now use an iPhone 12 or newer, station it on your desk, record your face, and immediately run it through MetaHuman Animator and apply it to a 3D character in real time, super high fidelity. And that's within the past 2 years that has released. And they're making further and further advancements into this. When we talk about the AI-driven thing, the algorithms that are being used to drive this information, it's from a depth channel inside of that camera. It's super crazy how that works on a cell phone now, when we think about where cell phones came from. In the next 3 to 5 years, it's not going to be limited to that aspect. We talked about the meta quest theory. Think the movie Ready Player One. The entire thought process behind that was to be able to physically live in a virtual environment. Everybody was doing it. You will get to a point where that same camera system on a head rig will now be able to track based off of audio. You're seeing this with AI happening now. People are getting scammed because they're picking up specific audio clips, generating an AI audio call where people are calling in saying that their kids are like stranded or whatever, and they need money, and you transfer money to them. That same audio dialogue will translate into a real-time game engine and apply it to whatever character you are currently playing. So your facial actions will happen based off of the sounds and the phonemes that you're physically creating. This is where the technology is going. AI is a way to get to that point, which is why that's the plus side of it. The negative side of it, we can go down that whole rabbit hole separately, but there are so many new avenues that are being technology's always had this theory of exponential growth. I was recently having a conversation about in my lifetime, watching an 8-track go to a cassette, to a CD, and just watching the audio side of this go. But if you think about this in the last 10 years, how fast this is happening. In the last 5 years, Unreal 5 released what, Jerry, 3 years ago? Roughly?
Yeah, roughly.
In 3 years, we went from we had to optimize scenes for a game engine to be able to make it playable. So the polygon count had to be low, textures had to be low, to now 3D scans of full environments. Polygon count now out the window. Taking the GIS information, you literally can fly a drone over an environment, do a 3D scan of that environment, drop it into the 3D software. Now you have textured and realistic map information at a fraction of the time based off the technology and where it's going. These are things that are being implemented in the game world. We have definitely bridged a gap between game, TV, and film when it comes to cinematics and real-time rendering. We're now seeing that where the architecture world is blurring. More and more people are coming into the Unreal realm from the design standpoint. It's opening up more opportunities across the board. But a lot of it is you have to have a technical mindset. Like you have to start thinking in this world, in this box, versus what we traditionally and how we have traditionally approached things. Peter referenced me talking about physically building something in 3D, because you have to start thinking in the 3D world. There is no difference in what you are physically doing tactily, operating a mouse and a keyboard, not to mention being able to do this in VR. You can model in VR now with haptic feedback. So these are different tactile things that we are getting. There's no difference between that tactile response, physically building in the real, the IRL, versus physically building in a virtual space. You get vibration function. It's a different tactile, but it's the same process. It's still triggering the same responses. So
and I think that, yeah, Ian, this is really great. And I think that like with all these technologies and all these questions, and I think I agree with you overall in that what we experience is right? We don't experience things like as they really are. And we could go into the philosophy behind that. We could talk about object-oriented ontology, which was a controversial thing. And the other thing, I want to give everyone here briefly, very briefly, because we are at the end of the formal part of this, a chance to, in just one sentence, say something you think that this panel did not talk about yet. And I am very serious about the one sentence. So would anyone like to briefly say what you think we want to continue talking about? And then after that, we're going to let this fade into the wrap-up part.
All right, I'll try. In a sentence?
Mike. Yes, one sentence. It can be kind of a run-on sentence, but eventually I'll just cut you off.
Yeah,
that was it. That was it, Mike. That was the sentence.
Do I get a fourth wish?
Peter's gonna send you something that says, "Now please mute."
I'd say I think what we didn't discuss in depth is the really important topic of agency with regard to clients and designers, we have we have broached this around the edges that we want interaction with our clients. But the concern is if we create an asset that our clients can walk through and appreciate, they still need the expertise of the designer to be able to work with them with empathy and create alternative endings, right? Alternative solutions to what the design can become. So my fear,
yeah, go ahead. Real quick.
So my fear is that if we, for instance, if we create a photorealistic image on day 2 of the design and the client is fooled by that, thinking that it is finished and it is fulfilling all of their criteria, we've done a huge disservice to the process, period.
Yes. And you also mentioned empathy, which I want to reiterate, that empathy is very important. And I think we should continue to make sure we put empathy forward. And with that, I'm going to end this panel discussion. There is much more to talk about, as we know. You guys, please hang out for another just 10 minutes or so and have a conversation, right? Stand up, stretch, whatever you guys want to do. I'll model that behavior. This is the end of this year's series. It's the first time we've done an actual series, and we are looking forward to doing more of them. I am not yet sure what the next 3 panel discussions for the spring semester of 2024 will be. I have some ideas that kind of linger on maybe concentrating on certain disciplines, whether that be architecture, landscape architecture, and interior architecture, or diving deeper into many of these concepts. For example, doing an entire panel on mapping or GIS, or diving in to maybe some of these other topics that we addressed, going back to fabrication, maybe talking very specifically about robotics. So everyone, please stay tuned. Thank you very much. And real quick, again, please, if you heard anything that you are interested in, please petition for it by using the link that's in the chat. And we look forward to working more with you as well. Again, we are just going to stand up and let this kind of, for the next 10 minutes, collapse into what we see at in-person panel discussions, where you watch people have random conversations. Thanks again, everyone. Bye for now.